You are listening to Know You're Crazy. My name is Susan Dene. We all have crazy. What separates us is how we choose to deal with it. I'm going to be delivering engaging and actionable tools to own your crazy, treat your crazy, and turn it into your own superpower. I hope that you walk away from this show feeling the power and strength within you. And never forget to enjoy your journey because you are worth it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Know You're Crazy show. You are listening to Emotional Recovery in the Raw, and I have brought back Mr. Joe, my husband, for this week's show. He was sharing with me before the show. He's like, I don't know if I'm feeling it this much this week. I said, oh, we'll get there. Today's topic, blended families, having a divorce or breakup in your past when you are a recovered alcoholic or addict is not uncommon. Rather, it would be uncommon not to have one in the rooms of recovery. Many of us have children who didn't ask to be along for a sober ride, but they are, and they didn't ask to have divorced or separated parents, but they do. So how does a sober couple navigate step parenting when many of us come from upbringings where the parenting was less than ideal? And now we need to not only learn how to parent, but how to be a step parent, a sober step parent. Do you ever wonder what to do with all those emotions of single parenting, co-parenting, and step parenting, let alone how to be a loving and supportive partner? Maybe your ex is the one with the blended family and you stand on the sideline judging them as if you know better about how they should be handling their situation. One of my favorite past sayings was, parenting didn't come with a handbook, but it should have. Why did nobody tell me about X, Y, and Z? I also had that same feeling when I had babies. I was like, why did somebody not tell me about breasts going away when you nurse? Yeah. Anyway, what is mine to parent? What is theirs? So as we're sober step parents, so Joe and I have been together for 15 years. We recently celebrated our 15-year anniversary. And we have a blended family of 5. He has 2 boys and I have 3 girls. And we used to joke when people would ask us, they'd always say, oh, the Brady Bunch. And we'd be like, no, we're not making this the Brady Bunch. Like, we're good. We're good with the 5. But what I wanted to start out before I jump into the step parenting story about you and I, because I'm going to open this up for individually what my experience was, because I was a step parent before I met Joe. Joe's journey with step parenting in this marriage. But before I get into that, I just kind of wanted to relate some statistics after I did some research today, which I found very eye-opening. Did you know that 70% of blended families end in divorce? 70%. And looking back on even our 15 years and some of the hurdles that we had, and even when I reflect back on my first marriage in the blended family in that scenario, I can appreciate the 70% number. Yeah. Because the one thing that sober couples have is if we are sober and we've had to go to the depths of walking in and admitting to ourselves that we have a problem with alcoholism or addiction, we're kind of on that self-growth path in a brutal way, but we've gotten there, which means that we've started to adopt a way of thinking in which we know that we can improve in a certain way of life.
Principles.
Yep. And it's somewhat easier once you have a baseline of recovery or a baseline of growth, once you've been there and done that, to then look at this other area of, say, step parenting and apply the same willingness, dare I say, or the same openness to however much you can get there in that arena, right? So 70% of blended families end in divorce. I guess what I'm saying is if you're a recovered alcoholic or drug addict in the rooms of recovery and you're in a blended family and you're pulling your hair out right now, wondering all these different things that we're going to talk about today, there's hope if you've been sober because you know the tools in which you can gain knowledge and a peace and understanding of how to do this thing. Alcoholism in 2023 literally had 14.3 million people diagnosed with it. 61% of men, 35% of women, and kids at 2.69%. And just a stat that I threw out there was that 83% of deaths occur at the age of 35 or older. And the only reason I threw that statistic out there was because when we're looking at parents who are dying of alcoholism, 83% of deaths of alcoholism are occurring at the age of 35. And how many of those individuals have children? 12.1% of children 17 years and under live with at least one parent with alcohol use disorder, is what they say. Alcohol use disorder. 12% are living with that. Research also showed that in blended families, that it literally takes about 2 to 3 years for the couple to get their stride. I think you and I could relate to that.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a bunch of, if not longer. Yeah, there's some speed bumps going on. 6 in 10, 63% women in remarriages are in blended families. So women in recovery, many of the remarriages that we do, we end up in blended families. And interesting enough, race doesn't matter. It's almost like it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're Hispanic. It doesn't matter if you're Black. It doesn't matter if you're white. Between 15 to 17% of families are blended, no matter what the race is, no matter what the culture is. And so this is more of a, almost as I was looking at these statistics, like really understanding, like as our world has evolved from the 50s, right, where we're going to stay to the point of misery, there's a release of shame, I think, today in regards to divorce. People aren't willing to stay beyond expiration dates anymore. Yeah. And they may also be cutting out sooner than needed if they don't get the necessary help or tools that they can have in order to make it work. And so anyways, when you remove the traditional step family definitions, there are 10.5 million children living in residential step families. That's a lot of kids. Yeah. That's a lot of kids. The reason why I wanted to talk about this today with Joe and me was because we are a sober couple. I said this last week, I'm 22 years clean and sober, and Joe? 19 years. And one of the things, if you listen to my show, Know You're Crazy, I'm very honest about the emotional ups and downs that life can have and what that is like to navigate in sobriety. And one of the things that can really tug on the heartstrings in sobriety is your kids.
Yeah.
It's your kids. How you raise your kids. The kids and the parenting can be a source of guilt, not doing it enough, not doing it well enough, beating yourself up if you lose your temper. We start to analyze ourselves in recovery to a certain degree because we want to stay sober. So we become super aware of our behaviors. And as I posted on my Instagram this week, I've not just discovered, I've known this for a little bit, but I'm a recovered alcoholic with a side hustle in codependency. Yeah. And so we bring that to the party. We're just like one big ball of fun when it comes to sobriety. So how do we parent, let alone step parent one another's children? So I'm going to start out by just simply telling a little bit of my story, the beginning of my story in step parenting. And then Joe, I'm going to switch over to you and let you talk about your experience. I was a step parent before I was a parent. I had a stepdaughter from my first marriage, and I was in her life for 11 years. And there were a lot of core understandings that happened in that relationship because I was also sober for the majority of that relationship, which means that when I started going to therapy, which is where I found some of my solutions for step parenting, a lot of it was around the blended family back then with his daughter. And then we added 3 more daughters to the mix. And so we had a half sibling situation in that role, but I was still a step parent. And my husband at the time was not a step parent, right? But I was. And so my dynamic always felt a little bit different. And it's really one of the things I appreciated, I guess, appreciated in a good way. I don't know if you'll like hearing this, but one of the things I appreciated was when we got together, you were a step parent also. And I knew that you were going to be experiencing some of the frustrations that I had experienced, but it was almost nice to know that somebody was in the ring with me.
Right. Playing field.
Yeah. Yeah. So I had my stepdaughter from my first marriage that was 11 years long. I'll explain some of my aha moments in that one through therapy and through just living, quite honestly, in sobriety. And then I met Joe, and Joe had 2 boys. And fortunately for me at that point, I had 11 years of experiencing step parenting, and I had 11 years clean and sober and a lot of work because, I'm almost like, I'm always looking for something to work on, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. So I'd done a lot of growth in that area. But then you had never had step parenting really before, right?
No.
Okay, so go ahead and just tell a little bit about your beginning, and what that was like for you when you met me.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. In the beginning, just the whole idea, first of all, of being a single parent, excuse me, was quite frankly terrifying. And unfortunately, I did have and this was even prior to me meeting you. I would use that term single parenting, and I had a mentor in my life at the time said, "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Did their mother die?" I said, "Well, no." And he goes, "Then you're not a single parent. So, get off the cross." And that helped bring it into perspective that this isn't all about me. This wasn't all on my shoulders. I got to show up as a father. So when we had first met and started dating, we did for quite a while. Yes, we were both parents, but we kept our relationship amongst ourselves and didn't bring the kids into the mix for, I think it was almost a year.
I think so.
So really kind of delayed that experience of, or maybe setting up a false pretense that, wow, this is pretty easy to be a step parent, when the reality was that wasn't the case. So I think one of the early things that I remember hearing you say was for a step parent, and this was a great relief for me to hear, I don't give directives to your children, because at that time they were your children, and I don't discipline your children. I would give directives and disciplines and expectations and all sorts of stuff to my boys, but we had yet to experience that. So really in the very beginning, I think the reality for me was delayed a little bit.
Yeah. And we did not live together for 5 years.
That's right.
Because we each had our own homes. We had those children. We were both amicably divorced at the time. But I remember, as you were sharing that, some of the things that I remember grappling was schedules. And, when you're in a blended family, the routine of the children with the other parent, or a parent who doesn't have another parent to even attempt to, they are literally a single parent. So they don't have the bandwidth to ask for somebody else to take the kid, where right. You and I were fortunate in that arena that we did have our kids, both our children had parents that they would trust to go to the other parents, right? But we still had to navigate the scheduling of that and what that looks like. And I remember that. The Wednesdays and the Thursday and the rotating of the weekends and what that looks like, and then trying to carve out the time for the relationship. So Joe hit on a really good point. And when I come back from break, I'm going to go through a couple of the key concepts, key ideas, key learning growth spurts, I like to say, that came in the beginning that really helped navigate some of the step parenting and where do I end and where do you begin and what do I say or not say, and what are my roles in this? Yeah. And so when we get back, I'll be talking about that. If you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. It's a sober couple talk tonight regarding blended families. I've asked my husband, Joe, to come with, and he's in for the ride, and he's warming up. So there we go. We will be back shortly. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Know You're Crazy show. You are listening to Emotional Recovery in the Raw. And today we are talking about sober couples and step parenting. And really anyone could listen to this who is a step parent, because I think that's going to really be the common denominator. But I always like to bring home the sobriety piece of it, because for those of us in sobriety, our emotions can run awry. They can be erratic. We can tend to be victims to an extreme sometimes. And the one thing that can really touch on our sobriety and can really be something that triggers us on, and sometimes into drinking, can be relationships with our children and blended families. Because many of us come into the rooms of recovery or get sober, and because of our addiction and our alcoholism, we have blown up marriages, we have blown up relationships, we're divorced. Unfortunately, children have been along for the ride sometimes through some of that. And I'm not going to say that's all been horrible for children, but it is part of the deal. And so as you sober up and you begin to have a life of recovery and you begin to have a relationship in your life, a lot of times those relationships will come with children and you have a blended family scenario. One of the statistics that I gave earlier was that 70% of blended families end in divorce.
That was high.
There's a reason for that. And as I invited Joe on this week because I was trying to see what the topic was going to be. And I thought this would be a really good topic to talk about because blended families are stressful and they can cause a lot of crazy, shall I say, depending on what buttons getting hit on. I mean, how do you learn to navigate that as a couple, but also as individuals in that marriage or in that relationship so that you don't, one, lose your sobriety, two, blow up the relationship, or three, really the most harmful thing is do damage to the children. I mean, children are already in a vulnerable position at that place, at that part, because they're the ones having to adapt to the divorce or live in the two separate homes. And I always like to bring that home because because there is a delicate sensitivity to that and awareness that needs to be in place. And then there's reality that you still have to live and you still have to have a home and you still have to have boundaries and all these different things. And so as a sober couple, how do you do that? So in the first quarter of the show, Joe and I were talking about kind of a brief little history. I step parented before I met Joe. It was in my first marriage for 11 years to my stepdaughter back then. And then I met Joe and he had two sons. And then Joe, your first experience was with me.
That's right.
And I have three daughters. And so we had a blended family of 5 children, still do. And so we've had quite the journey with that. And what I was starting to talk about a little bit was the beginning of the scheduling and going back and forth and being independent within our relationship, but yet dependent upon the exes and what they were doing and how they were showing up emotionally.
Which could be vastly different than the reality of the home that we were putting together.
Yeah. So Joe and I both have exes that are self-admitted recovered alcoholics. Sober, not, I don't know, none of my business, but that is part of our story also. So we had like this awareness of growth, of sobriety all the way around. And so you touched on something before we went to break. You touched on the no directive and no discipline. And so this is something that I'm going to talk about. So if you're in a situation right now with a blended family and you're pulling your hair out and you're wondering what's mine, what's his, or you don't even wonder, you're just doing it all, or maybe you feel unappreciated, or it's just something's not rocking and rolling for you. One of the key concepts or key ideas, I think, that originated from my original therapy in my first marriage was when my therapist looked at me and she said, "Susan, she's not your kid." Because I was attempting to be the parent under the roof. Now, what does a parent mean? What did a parent mean to you?
Do as I say.
Yeah.
My house, my rules, that arrogant approach, if you will.
Yeah. And kids, depending on if you haven't grown your parenting tools yet or your perspective on children, that might be the case. But discipline, clean up your room, put the dishes away, provide a consequence. And what I was soon to learn in my first marriage was she's not your kid. You never discipline her. And I'm like, well, that's not fair. It's my house. He's not doing anything. Not Joe, my first husband.
I understand, yeah.
But I mean, that was the feeling. It's not fair. What do you mean I'm not supposed to discipline this kid? She's under my roof. And anytime I've worked with women in recovery who have a blended family, and even watching you go through that acceptance of that, it's mind baffling because everybody wants a right.
That's a good way to put it.
To discipline.
Yeah.
Everybody wants control over other people's behaviors, right? And then we throw in beliefs about children and why that should be.
Or once more, I throw in my belief.
Yeah.
So I could go to you and say, would you please discipline your child? Mm-hmm. And then dictate the way that needs to come out. But guess what? That's my idea. Mm-hmm. Not your idea, not your belief. So that's when we started to live together. That's when it got real. I know that sounds like a well, duh. But having never co-parented before with a blended family, that becomes very real when my ideas don't mesh or my beliefs don't mesh with you.
Yep.
You or the other partner in that relationship.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is like a number 2 thing, right? So the first one was not your kid. You're not going to discipline them. You're not going to give them directives. That's the bio parent's job. That's the bio parent's job. It's not your job. That took a lot, right? And there's all kinds of reasons that I would want to justify and think I should be able to, and all these things. But at the end of the day, what I found was when I would try to direct, or I did try to discipline, guess what happens with the relationship with the stepchild? They don't want anything to do with you. And they're angry at you, and they avoid you. And suddenly, now you're the bad guy, bad woman, whatever, in the household, right? Nobody wants to be around you because you're taking responsibility for something that's not yours to take responsibility for. And so you're bringing up the point, the communication has to happen with the parent. And then number 2 that you're bringing up is you have to wrap your head around the idea that your partner, the one you're in a relationship with, does not parent like you.
Right.
Yeah, we really went through that. Joe and I really went through that. We were we were talking about this before the show. You had boys you were parenting.
Yeah. So, and that was the other thing. I had no experience with girls. You had no experience with boys.
And some people may be like, it doesn't really matter. And
I would disagree, but that's not my, that's not my
ideally, maybe it shouldn't matter, but let's just get realistic about layers of beliefs and influences that we're raised within. Okay. I'm not trying to rehab the whole world right now. Right. Ideally, no, if you want to get to that level of growth and on parenting, yes, ideally, maybe that shouldn't matter if they're boys and girls, but 90% of the time it does matter. And a male, your generation where you're coming has probably, I'm assuming, a perspective on how boys should be raised.
A little different than today's generation. I'm 61.
Yeah. So for where I'm 12 years younger and I'm raising 3 girls. And so let's just say I was more of a soft hitter where Joe was more of the disciplinary perspective.
And boys respond differently.
Yeah.
Than girls do.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah. Having the boys in the house and having the girls in the house, completely different energies a lot of the time.
Boys tend to stare at you like mouth breathers. And you don't know if they're hello.
Anybody home?
Girls tend to be a lot more responsive and you're talking to somebody. There's back and forth.
Boys are loud. The boys were loud. I remember that. The boys were always super loud, like TV's loud, games are loud, that type of thing, right?
Until you talk to them, and then they're extremely silent.
And then, and when you got a family, so the other dynamic that we have that I'm talking about today is we had a sober family. So a family in recovery. And so Joe and I are also talkers. I mean, we're sitting around a podcast today. So we're used to talking about things. And so when you get a blended family, and there's all these emotions running through the house, because remember, everybody's having their own experience. Yes. So I'm having my own experience with my kids and how they're reading the room with Joe and the boys and how are they being impacted. And I have 3 daughters. And so each one I'm aware of. Right. So here you go. Here you go with the codependency stuff or just the awareness. And where you're coming into the house and you're aware of the impact the family is going to be having on the boys. And so everybody's having their own experience within the family dynamic of the blended family. And so as parents, 2 adults in sobriety, but also just as step parents in a blended family, how did we manage that dynamic and still stay together, get through the bumps, and really be able to be talking about it today?
Grace.
A whole lot of grace with one another. Very true. A whole lot of grace. And you know what? The other thing is we had some pretty hard conversations, some really hard conversations about that parenting may work for you, but it doesn't work for me. And I'm okay with that. And vice versa. And so we had some really tough conversations with one another. And I think we did an okay job not spilling over all our insecurities and stuff onto the kids, but they felt it at times. We had some crazy stuff in our house.
Yeah. And addiction will do that.
Yeah, addiction will do that.
The one caveat that I didn't mention, so no directive, no discipline, but the flip side, and I've had this reaffirmed through counselors and therapy and just literature that I've read, that for me as a step parent, what I can do is I can show up with unconditional love. And I was told the best you can do is to earn their respect. And I can say wholeheartedly on both sides, I have the respect of all three of my stepdaughters, who I don't even like using that term today. I consider my daughters. And they have at times come back and said, you know what? Yeah, your dad. And in this house, and that's the best you can hope for. And I think on your side, in fact, I don't think I know for a fact that you have the respect of the boys.
Yeah.
And vice versa. And I think that is a great goal to attain, because it takes me out of the driver's seat. That doesn't mean I'm not going to step in with the sermon, or I'm going to put my foot down in something that has to do with safety or well-being. That's a given. No, we were joking about the toilet paper, but at some point I'm going to give up the fight that toilet paper goes over, not under. But you know what? It's worth losing that battle, because in the end, it doesn't really matter.
Finally, we've gotten there, maybe, with the toilet paper.
I know I'm not alone on that. Okay.
I think that's okay. I won't comment, but it's funny because in blended families or just big families. I mean, I would say we have been a very kind of a big family because of how many children, how many dynamics. We've also had children in addiction. We have been through that. We have been through a lot of therapy individually. I would like to say that about Joe and I. So one of the things that I've always been an advocate of is therapy, along with recovery work and the 12 steps and all of the above. I mean, you give me a program, I'm going to work it probably right, because I'm always about discovery. But when Joe and I got together, because we both had a pretty extensive background in therapy, and we were working a pretty good program of recovery, and we both work with sponsors in the program. One of the things that we didn't do was we never came together in therapy, family therapy, not because I think we could have if we needed to, but we did individual work, and then we'd come back together to discuss that. And it was almost, now that I'm talking about that out loud and reflecting, almost kind of nice in a way, because we were able to listen what the other person would bring, but then they would also be bringing their own perspective with it. And so we'd be able to inquire, hey, did so-and-so have anything good today? Or if something was picked up. And so watching one another also with our aha moments in step parenting and in a blended family has been interesting over the years. And as I said last week, I think one of the best things that we do for our marriage, and I think anybody can do in a partnership of any sort, is each person to continue to be individually responsible for their part in that.
And to that point, I am back in therapy today with the sole purpose so that I can show up as a better stepfather to the last teenager in the house, because that's important. I think the goal's always been, in the parenting context, is how can I continue to show up as a better parent to my boys, better parent to the girls.
And I think that also hits on what is the role? What role do you want to assume? And one of the things that I learned in my first marriage, after going through the ups and downs, and so what I did in my first marriage, and so some of you may or may not be guilty of this, or it's familiar to you. I had a first marriage where my husband at the time did not like talking to the mother of the child too much. And when they did talk, there was always a conflict. And so guess what I did? I went ahead and inserted myself as the communicator between those two when it came to stuff with the child. And so mom would call to arrange something for the kid. And then I know anybody listening to this who knows anything about codependency is like, oh my God, yeah, exactly. It didn't work out too well. I thought I was doing well. I thought I was doing the best thing for the kid. I thought that, if this was the easiest transition, then let's just do it. And I was also keeping my husband at the time from actually any consequence whatsoever of not getting along with his ex. And so instead of allowing two adults to function, I was the mediator and had no business being there. And I started to understand what my role as a step parent was. And here was the very first stark reality for me. Step parenting is not fair. It's not going to feel lovey-dovey likely. But I do get to be a role model of some sort. Imagine the fun aunt, right? The family friend. And that can feel so like, are you kidding me? They're in my house. They're messing up my dishes. They stole my shirt. They used my pliers. They didn't put them back. And I'm just going to be some fun aunt. But an aunt would redirect them and let them remind them of what to do that's appropriate. But the disciplining and all that is the responsibility of the parent. And I thought that was a really good way to put that when you're the step parent in the family, because defining your role and understanding what that is for you can be very complicated. And the pressure on the relationship comes when I'm thinking you should be behaving a certain way with the kids, right? Because I have a certain belief in parenting and maybe you have a certain belief in parenting. And if we're not talking about that as a couple, and especially as a sober couple, guess what happens? We build resentment. Yeah, in judgment. And so I think what popped in my head just now was, what would you say in step parenting for you in a blended family was the most challenging piece of it for you?
Letting you parent your children.
Yeah.
Contrary to what my beliefs were.
Yeah.
Or trusting. That was another thing that was pointed out to me, is trust the other parent.
Yeah, that's a good
one. I come to you, I tell you what's going on, I ask for input, or I defer the actions to you, and then turn around and complain about it, or doubt that action. That's very corrosive.
Yeah.
And that was a huge one, to let go of the reins.
Yeah. What did I put here? Because I spot on, Joe. I had made a note here that I had to learn. Where's it at? Here it is. Witnessing. I needed to learn when to let go and let Joe. I needed to learn when to let go and let Joe. And what I meant by that was understanding that just because you're not doing it the way I would do it, that you need to have a relationship with my kids, that piece of it is kind of none of my business. But to learn and to let go and let you do whatever you needed to do to start to trust you, because we came from different perspectives on parenting, and because we had been through so much with our children, actually. I mean, we really have been through a lot with the kids. But to learn to trust you and to let go, but also understand and appreciate, what do you do with the uncomfortable feeling when you disagree with about how your partner parents? That uncomfortable feeling, what do you do with it? Because it's not that you want to take it out on your partner, because if you do, the quality of your relationship is going to be damaged. But you also have to find somewhere to put that energy, or how to communicate it, because I can communicate with you if something in your parenting frustrates me, or if I disagree with it, and then you get to do whatever you want to do with that. And sometimes him and I have done that, and we've changed. I mean, we've literally made a change, vice versa, right? One or the other, and said, okay, I hear you and I won't do that no more. Or I hear you and I can appreciate that, and I will do that differently next time. And there's been other times where it's just like, don't know what to tell you, but I'm probably still going to do it the same way. Yeah.
I think that's where the ego gets in the way.
I think so too.
And some of that false pride, like, I know better.
I think so too.
And I don't always know better. In other places I go to, is I may go to one of my mentors, and I'll take it back to, the person that I'm seeing in therapy, saying, hey, here's what went on. What do you see? I don't always see things as they are, because I'm filtering it.
Yeah.
And some of it based on the way that I was brought up.
Yeah.
Which, right, wrong, or indifferent, can have a huge impact.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's been more realizations too, we may be talking about this later, but how that no directives, no discipline changes as the child gets older, the stepchild.
Yeah, because there's a difference between when you're raising them and when we got together, my youngest was 1.5.
Yeah, even maybe 13, 14 months.
Yeah.
Young.
And that one's now almost 17, 16, 17,
yes.
Right? And so it's been a while. And so how you parent the 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and the communication with them at that age and how that develops over time. And then also as a couple, you begin to trust one another more and more, and your ideals, as we live this life together, we've also learned to parent together. Yeah. And we've learned where to stay out of each other's business when it comes to our kids. Because like I said, we've had children recovered from addiction. We have practicing children who use that may or may not be addicts, but that affects us because we're recovered alcoholics. That affects us because we're recovered addicts. And so we can understand and appreciate there are certain boundaries in this house, and yet how it affects me. Like, for example, and this is why I'm talking about sober couples, because if one particular type of drug makes its way into the house, and not because we've allowed it, folks, but we've had kids, we have teenagers, we had a lot of reality. It's reality. One particular type of drug may trigger me and do nothing for him. In fact, I'm just going to tell a story. Oh my gosh, it was during COVID. We were in it. We had like 5 years of really going through it. My father had passed away. I was gone from the house for like 2 months. We had children in addiction. We have one of our children's actually sober from fentanyl. We were in it. And I had come home, and one of the other kids had brought marijuana into the house. And pot was one of my drug of choices. So Joe wasn't home, but Joe had called me, and he's like, somebody's got pot in the house. And they've all probably brought this into the house, but somebody's got pot in the house, and I can smell it, but I can't find it. And so he leaves the house. I'm coming home, and it was like a highly emotional time in our lives. And so I come in the house, and I'm like a hound, like, where's the pot? Right. So I go downstairs, and I'm sniffing around, and I find it. And I take it, it's like in this little glass tube. So folks, I'm 22 years clean and sober. Pot shops weren't around when I was getting high, and thank God they weren't. But so I'm like almost amazed that there's like flavors now, and there's like things that people have, and they come in like glass tubes, and they're all pretty, and like joints come pre-rolled and shit. It's like, I didn't know, sorry about my language, but it was like, wow. So I'm sitting in the bathroom upstairs. I grabbed this, like, I remember like a little plastic case with a lid, and I come upstairs, and nobody's home but me. And I remember I'm grieving the loss of my father. There's a lot going on. We've got children recovering. Oh, menopause, the hormones are diving. Like, I am a hot mess. And now I've got my drug of choice sitting in my hand that was brought in my house by my child. There's the recipe. You ever want to know how people go back out? This is how it works. And so I'm sitting there in the bathroom, and I'm looking at it, and I'm smelling it, and I'm having the conversation of, this just needs to go away. And so here comes Joe. I hear him coming down the hallway. He comes home, and he comes down, and I hear him walking real fast, and he opens up the door, and he's like, hey, Mr. Happy Guy. And here I'm sitting here with this joint, and I go, take this. And so in his disconnect about what it was doing to me, he said, you say to me, oh, no big deal. Pot does nothing for me. Now, if that was pills, we'd have a whole other conversation going on. And I'm sitting here like, coming out of this warped mindset of really wanting to smoke that joint. But that's how it affects our family. And so, like, I just said, take it. And so he took it, and he left, and that was the end of that. Right. And I didn't crave. Obviously, I hit a meeting and did what I need to do for me. And we revisited boundaries with those kids. Yeah. Because we've had to revisit a few times. But having that going in our home, and then so important to appreciate in recovery what that can do to one another, the crazy that it can trigger, but then also not hating each other's kids for it. I think that's where the love and compassion comes in love and compassion as a spouse. Yeah. Like understanding when one of our children is suffering from addiction, and we have been through it, folks, to not take it out on the other parent, and to be there as loving and compassionately as you can as a recovered couple. And that is the essence of sobriety. True, yes. Loving, caretaking, in a good way, caretaking sobriety. Yes. Yeah. So that's the thing, right? So how do you navigate all of that? And I guess that's how do you navigate all of that? And I guess that's how.
Well, you do it with the love and the tolerance. And, the reality is with five children, say kids with five children, it would have been nice if all of them dodged that, but they haven't. They've all done it. They're all in it. Today, everybody's healthy, everybody's happy, everybody's living well. Yeah. And we're down to one last child who we get to set boundaries again.
And the thing about it is, I think for me, and then we're gonna cut to break, is so when we had one of our children suffering from a horrible addiction, one of the things that I had said to you was, I said, the likelihood that they recover might be higher in this home, hopefully, because we've shown them the path.
And that's a fact.
They know where recovery's at. Our kids know where AA is. They know where Al-Anon is. They know what it looks like to work with a therapist. They know what it looks like to work with a mentor. Like, our children have been given the tools. So at the end of the day, I always say, at the end of the day, if anything would ever happen to me, I at least know that my kids and our children know where the solution is at if what hits the fan.
And that's right? A message that's been delivered by both of us to all five children.
Yeah. And I think that's, the responsibility. Yeah. The responsibility to parenting in sobriety. And I swear I am going to go to break here, but I got one more thing I got to say. I was in early sobriety and I was sitting in my meeting that was 40 minutes away, and they had a magazine there they call the Grapevine. And I mean, when I say early sobriety, folks, I was like 30 days clean. It was, was I going to that meeting at 30 days? Definitely within the first 6 months. It was early. And I remember I had at the time a 1.5-year-old, and I was sitting there, and you know how you're so overwhelmed and everything comes crashing down, and your reality is you're an alcoholic, and you're taking that in, and then you're taking in the wreckage. And when you get sober, half the time life is not good. You got debt, you got family calling, you got maybe death. I mean, who knows, right? Like, it's not good. And so why not add on, what the hell am I going to do as a parent? And I remember sitting there in this meeting and thinking to myself, oh my God, if I'm like this, then my kids could be like this. And I remember just reading the Grapevine, that article that day, and it talked about your responsibility is to stay sober and show the way. And so simple, but not easy, right? And so as a blended family, I think that we've done a pretty good job, both as two sober people, even when our children have been mad at us and said, Mom, look, I know you think you got a sober home, but you don't. You don't want to
coming from me.
It's not us. But vibrationally, we've carried alcoholism and addiction in this home. I mean, recovery or not, all this another show. Anyway, okay, we're going to go to break, guys. And when we come back, I'm going to go through my list about any other top tips, because we've already almost blown an hour by. Top additional tips that we've done as a blended family to help in step parenting. And I'll do a recap of what I've talked about already for anybody who's listening or taking notes. And if you want to just kind of take this home with you and be like, hey, this is helpful, I'll go back through those in the last part of the show when we return shortly from break. Thanks. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Know You're Crazy show. My name is Susan Dene, and you are listening to Emotional Recovery in the Raw. And today we're doing Sober Couple Talk. I invited my husband Joe on to talk about sobriety and blended families and what that has been like for us in our journey. I believe there's a lot of good feedback. One of the statistics I gave in the beginning of the show was that 70% of blended families end up divorced. 70% of blended families end up divorced because it's tricky. It's tricky, and starting to understand, where I stop and where you begin, and what's my role with the children, and what's not my role with what's not my role with the children is a lot of it, because the beliefs behind a parent's role and the reality of a step parent's role are two different things. Yeah. In fact, you should probably just take the whole step parent, the whole parent word out of it. Like acquaintance, or like I was saying, you almost want to put the imaginary, like you're the favorite aunt or something hat on. And so I said before we went to break, I was going to go rehash a couple of the top learning things that we've had and some of the, I guess, best practices that you and I have done over the years to survive happily for the most part. 15 years of marriage with 5 children, blended family. We've had addiction go through the family. We've had tragedies at different personally with our own parents. I mean, we got through some stuff. And both stayed sober through it. Sibling rivalry, that's another one. And so we've stayed sober through all of that. And so some of the top things that we learned in that journey, and then I also combined this with some research today when I was looking into just step families and step parenting. That's where those statistics were coming from. But one of the top ones was no direction. And what'd you say? No direction, no directive.
No discipline.
No discipline. For the bio parent does the disciplining. The bio parent does the disciplining. That was probably the hardest for me to understand back in my first marriage, to wrap my head around that. And I know it was challenging for you in this marriage when you realize that, because here's number 2. You have to understand, how do I want to say this? It's good to become, I'm fighting for words here. I need to be okay with how you parent.
Yes. I
have to learn how to sit in the uncomfortable when you parent differently than me.
Trust.
Which is hard when you don't discipline like I would, or I don't discipline like you would. So that's where that whole, I can't give directive, I can't give discipline, and I need to be appreciative that you and I don't parent together, and be understanding, and really, what do I do with all that frustration at that point?
And then not to have that discussion in front of the children. I know that sounds like a duh, but yeah, if there's that disagreement in parenting, that happens behind closed doors.
Number 3, that brings up a good one for me, is this has to be united. If this isn't united, trust me, those kids are going to pick up on it.
Conquer and divide.
And it's not a
divide and conquer, I should say.
Well, and it's not even a like us against them, but it is, we have to have agreements about what's allowed in the house and what's not allowed in the house. And so we had used an example of one of those agreements is we want a sober home. We try. But the kids would always bring in something, usually marijuana, sometimes harder stuff. And then we have to redirect, but him and I have to be on the same page about that.
There's consequences for it.
And there's consequences for it, but we have to be in agreement. We have to be in agreement with the type of communication that would be allowed in the house. We never allowed yelling, screaming, swearing, the occasional blow up in the house. I mean, that would happen, but 90% of the time, our home is not going to involve yelling, screaming, all of that stuff. So when you've got hormonal teenagers, or you've got addiction in the home, that's kind of a big deal. And so we had to have another agreement. Like, that was an agreement that we put down with the kids, and also our own behavior as step parents, as a couple. Your behavior as a couple is going to directly be influencing the children.
I think it comes down, I've used the word respect a couple, 3 times, and I could see it in the children in all of the years of the 15 years of raising the boys and the girls in this home. There was never one time that any of the children lashed out against the step parent. The name calling, the foul language. There's the teenage angst and that disgruntled disposition that they live with from about age 9 till 35. That's going to be there. But there was always this level of respect in it was there. It was always there. There was always something important to stress.
But how we did that, and I think it's really important to let folks know why that was because whether or not we agreed with it, we always allowed our kids to have a voice. Yes. Now, that voice, for example, my girls may have been frustrated over him or the boys, but they got to express that to me in our private time. Same with Joe and the boys. Yes. If the boys were overwhelmed or they had something to deal with, they would be able to express that to Joe. And so as listening parents, it's super important to be there and to hear those children, because remember, they're in for this ride for you in sobriety. They are in the ride for you for sobriety. All right. So we are actually coming close to, I told you the whole hour just flew by because there's so much content here that we could talk about. learning that the relationship with the parents and their exes, Joe's relationship with his ex is none of my business. My relationship with my ex is none of Joe's business, yet we are represented in those relationships. And so that is something that we had to overcome. I personally had to overcome. I had feelings of insecurity. I had feelings of jealousy. I did all kinds of things in the beginning of our marriage that I had to learn to deal with and manage. And then there's no direction, no discipline, being okay when the other parent doesn't parent like you, understanding schedules can feel overwhelming, managing all over the place can feel overwhelming, staying a united team as far as your agreements are concerned, and being able to be in agreement about the environment in which you're raising the children in, and allowing the children to have a voice when they are overwhelmed and when they feel they need to be heard, so that they can stay respectful, because in my opinion, children become super resentful when nobody's listening to them and they feel unheard So thank you for coming on the show today. I appreciate it. See, I knew we'd get through it. All right. So folks, if you are joining us today, thank you, one, for joining us today. If you want to reach out to me for any coaching or any feedback on the show, feel free at my website at SusanDenee, DENEE.com. If there's any men out there looking to work with somebody, Joe is available. You can reach him at my website. Also, just shoot me an email. Would be more than happy to put you in touch with him. But thank you for joining the Know You're Crazy show. Have a nice night, and we will see you next week. Take care. You have been listening to Know You're Crazy.
Crazy.
And my name is Susan Denee. We are identifying, understanding, and treating your crazy one episode at a time. Tune in to transformationtalkradio.com. To connect with me or Growth Spurt Your Life, please visit SusanDenee.com. That's Susan Denee, DENEE.com.